The rain wasn't the kind that nurtures. It was harsh, relentless, the kind that stings your skin and soaks you through in seconds. Max stood there, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, the wet fabric of her coat clinging to her as the cold air cut through her. The mansion she had grown up in loomed behind her, towering and silent, but it felt like 1,000 miles away. The family she had loved and hated had just expelled her from their lives, with nothing but disdain. "You're a disappointment, Maxine." Her father's voice rang out, cutting through the storm's roar. His words felt like daggers, sharper in the cold, his tone laced with a finality she hadn't expected. "A complete failure." Max stood still, feeling the weight of those words settle over her. Behind him, her mother's face was like stone, arms crossed, eyes narrow with contempt. The mask she had worn for years was now as cold as the rain, a silent judgment of the daughter who had dared to dream of something other than their family's empire. "This is the last time I'll say this," her father continued, his voice void of emotion. "If you walk away now, you'll never return. No inheritance, no support, nothing." Max adjusted the strap of her bag and met his gaze. The words they had expected, pleas, apologies, breaking down, never came. She was done. Fine. The word hung in the air, shocking them both. The silence that followed felt too long, too heavy, but Max didn't break. Not this time. She turned away, every step she took moving her farther from the life they had planned for her. Every step was freedom, every drop of rain washing away the last vestiges of the person they wanted her to be. Their final words followed her down the driveway. "You'll fail, Max. You'll come crawling back when you realize how worthless your dreams are." But Max didn't look back. Not once. Max could still feel the weight of her father's words, even after she had stepped out into the storm. She kept walking, her bag growing heavier with every step, as though it was carrying the burden of every expectation she had ever been forced to bear. Mason Industries wasn't just a company, it was their family's legacy. Her father had built it from the ground up, and he had spent her entire life grooming her to follow in his footsteps, to take the reins when he was gone. The idea that she could have a future outside of that world, creating art instead of profit, was anathema to him. It didn't fit into his vision of what she was meant to be. A daughter who could extend the family's empire, not someone who dreamed of being an actress in Hollywood. She could hear her mother's voice from years ago echoing in her mind, cold and cutting. "You'll regret this, Maxine. You have everything. Why throw it away for some fantasy?" Her mother's disappointment was a constant undercurrent, as if every moment of joy Max found in her own path was tainted by the shadows of unfulfilled expectations. "You're going to ruin everything we've worked for," her mother would say. It wasn't about Max's happiness. It was about the family's reputation, their image, their empire. Max had tried for years to make them proud. She had attended meetings. She had learned the ins and outs of corporate strategy, but it was never enough. They never saw her. They only saw the future they had carved out for her, one that didn't have room for her true passion. But now, standing in the rain, all of that was fading away. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had taken the first step toward her own future, a future where she could finally be herself. The first few months after leaving her family were harder than Max had imagined. With nothing but her duffel bag, a few savings, and an old phone, She arrived in Hollywood. The city that promised dreams to everyone seemed determined to swallow hers whole. Her best friend Mike offered her a couch to crash on in a tiny apartment that smelled of stale pizza and cheap cologne. It wasn't glamorous, but it was all she had. Max found a job at a local electronics store, selling gadgets and accessories to tourists and tech enthusiasts, anything to keep herself afloat. The hours were long, the work draining, but every spare moment she was back to her laptop, studying scripts, watching old movies, and learning everything she could about acting. When she wasn't working, she was delivering pizzas at night. Each delivery was a reminder of how far she had fallen from the world her family had once promised her. Mike didn't understand the technical side of what she was trying to do, but he understood as something more important: drive. "You're insane, Max," he would say, eyes wide as he watched her stay up late, coding and learning her lines until the sun came up. "But you're the good kind of insane." It wasn't just about acting. It was about proving to herself that she could make it, that she could succeed on her own terms, without the shadow of her father's empire looming over her. Every night, after another grueling shift, she'd sit on Mike's couch with the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, but the spark inside her still burned bright. She didn't know where her journey would lead, but she knew one thing: she wouldn't stop. Max had almost forgotten what it felt like to dream. After months of rejection and dead-end auditions, the sting of failure had dulled. Her hope, once bright and relentless, now flickered like a dying flame, hidden beneath the weight of bills, rejection letters, and the hollow hum of late-night deliveries. But then, out of nowhere, an email appeared. It was short, professional, and straight to the point. "Dear Maxine Rivera, after reviewing your recent self-tape, we would like to invite you for an audition for the lead role in The Edge of Tomorrow. Please respond at your earliest convenience." Max stared at the screen for a long moment, disbelief washing over her. The name of the film meant nothing to her, but the opportunity. This was what she had been working for. Her heart raced as she quickly typed out a response, her fingers trembling slightly as she hit send. That afternoon, she was in front of a casting agent at a small studio in downtown LA. The room was nothing like the high-end casting calls she had imagined. No bright lights or intimidating agents. It was a small, intimate setting, a small table, a director's chair, and a lone camera. Max stood in front of it, trying to push aside the fear that bubbled in her chest. She knew what this moment could mean. It was her first real shot. She took a deep breath, let the nerves settle, and gave it everything she had. As she delivered her lines, every word felt like it mattered. This wasn't just about acting. It was about proving she belonged here, in this world she'd only ever dreamed of. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. 2 days later, she got the call. It wasn't the lead role, but they offered her a smaller part, one that could be a stepping stone, a chance to make a name for herself. She didn't care about the size of the role. What mattered was that someone saw her. For the first time in months, Max allowed herself to smile. She was on her way. Max was in her small apartment, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the screen of her laptop. The film she had just wrapped was gaining traction. The buzz was spreading, and her name was starting to be whispered in casting rooms. She knew it was her moment. Finally, after years of struggling, she was starting to be seen. But that night, an unexpected call came. It was from her father, Don Rivera. "Maxine," he began, his voice cold, businesslike. "We need to talk." Max's stomach twisted. It had been months since she'd heard from him, and when he spoke, it was never good news. She had cut all ties with the family, unwilling to return to the life they had mapped out for her. But she couldn't ignore him forever. She knew this conversation was inevitable. She stood, pacing the small room as she waited for him to speak. When he finally did, his words felt like a punch to the gut. "We've been watching your progress," he continued, "and frankly, it's impressive. But you're still wasting your time. Hollywood? It's not a place for people like you. You're just a stepping stone for others." Max's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to speak, to argue, but her father's words kept coming, like a tidal wave she couldn't escape. "Your brother, James, has done everything right. He's maintaining the family legacy, growing the business. He's the one who will carry Mason Industries into the future. You, well, you're just another actress, no different from any other. You'll burn out. Trust me." The words stung, not because they were new, but because they came from him, the man who had been her biggest supporter as a child, the man who had shaped her life, was now telling her that everything she was doing was worthless. She wasn't just a disappointment to him, she was nothing. Max's voice cracked when she spoke. "Why are you doing this? I've worked for this. I'm not asking for your approval anymore. I just want you to see me." But Don didn't respond. His silence, louder than anything he could have said. The call ended with the cold finality of a door slamming shut. Max stood frozen in the silence of her apartment, staring at the now blackened screen. The warmth of her small success, the excitement of her new career, faded instantly. She wasn't just fighting the industry. She was fighting her family's legacy, their refusal to accept her for who she was. The betrayal wasn't just about the lack of support. It was about the fact that her father had never truly believed in her. He had never believed in her dream. Max hadn't planned for it to go this far. She had hoped that the family, with all their years of power and success, would eventually come around. She had hoped that they would see how much she had changed, how far she had come. But after the call from her father, everything she thought she understood about her place in this world shattered like glass. The next day, the studio was buzzing. Max had a meeting with Chris Blake, the director she had been working with on her latest film. He was kind, encouraging, everything Max needed in a mentor. But as they sat in his office, the weight of her father's rejection hung over her like a storm cloud. "I need you to be honest with me, Max," Chris said, eyes focused on her. "How are you really doing? The press is saying good things, but I can see the tension in you. You've been off lately. What's going on?" Max swallowed, pushing the emotions that threatened to rise back down. She didn't want to burden him. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being the one who didn't need help. But now, with everything crashing down around her, the floodgates opened. "I just spoke to my father," she said, her voice low. "And it's over. I'm done trying to make him see me. I thought maybe there was a chance he'd understand, that he'd see what I've accomplished. But I was wrong. I'm just wasting my time." Chris's expression softened, and he leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Max, I'm not going to pretend I know your family dynamics, but I do know one thing. You've come a hell of a long way on your own. And whether or not your father sees that, that's on him, not you. Her chest tightened as she held his gaze. It's not just him. It's my whole family. They never wanted me to do this. They never believed I could. Chris gave a slow nod. That's the problem with legacy. It's a weight that doesn't fit everyone. You're carrying a burden that isn't yours to bear. It's time you let it go. Max looked away, the words sinking in. She had spent so much of her life trying to prove something to them, to fit into their narrow vision of success. But now, the realization hit her like a slap. She didn't need them to validate her. For the first time in a long time, Max let herself feel the anger bubbling inside her, the frustration that had been building for years. She wasn't just fighting the system, she was fighting for her right to exist outside of it. For the first time, she was ready to stop asking for permission. Max's first big break came when she least expected it. She had been working tirelessly for months, auditioning, failing, and sometimes even questioning why she was still in the game. Her name still didn't mean anything to the people who mattered in the industry, and she had long since stopped looking for validation from her family. But then, one afternoon, an unexpected call came in. It was from Chris Blake, the director she had worked with on the indie film that had gained some recognition. He was now directing a high-profile project, a film that would star A-listers, and he wanted her to be part of it. "Max, we've been thinking about you for the role," Chris said, his voice filled with excitement. "It's a big step, but I believe you're ready. It's a key part, and I think you'll blow them away." The words felt surreal. Max had been auditioning for years, struggling for every inch of recognition, but here she was, being offered something substantial. It wasn't just a supporting role. It was a character with depth, a character that could set her on the map. As she sat down to sign the contract, the weight of everything she had fought for crashed down on her. She had made it. Not in the way her family would have wanted. She wasn't following the legacy. She wasn't a part of the business they had carefully built, but in a way that felt so much more hers. The first day on set felt like a dream. The crew was buzzing with energy, the stars in the film were larger than life, and Max was just a part of it. She wasn't the newcomer anymore. She had a seat at the table, not just as an actress, but as someone who had proven she could hold her own. It was humbling, but also empowering. Max's character, a troubled young woman trying to escape her past, resonated with the audience in ways that no one had expected. The film wasn't just a commercial success. It was critically acclaimed, and Max's performance was praised for its authenticity and rawness. This wasn't the big break that came with millions of dollars, but it was the moment that finally proved to her that she could do it. Her name was mentioned in the same sentences as stars who had once seemed untouchable. And while the success felt sweet, there was still a lingering ache, a question of whether she could ever truly escape the shadow of her family's expectations. But for now, she allowed herself to enjoy this moment. This was her victory, her dream unfolding in real time. And the best part? She had done it on her own terms. It had been weeks since Max's breakout role had taken the industry by storm. The press was calling her the next big thing. Her name was now on everyone's lips, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was where she was meant to be. But there was still one thing she hadn't anticipated: her father's call. She was sitting in her trailer, flipping through a script, when her phone rang. The name that flashed across the screen made her pause. Don Rivera. Her heart sank. She hadn't spoken to him since that fateful day she left. Not since his harsh words about her wasting her potential. She had told herself she didn't need him anymore. But there, in that moment, with the weight of her recent success and the distance between them, the phone felt heavy in her hand. Max exhaled sharply and answered. Yes, Father. His voice was colder than she remembered, but there was something different this time. There was an edge of hesitation, something almost unsure. Maxine, I need to talk to you. It's about Mason Industries. She felt her stomach tighten. She hadn't wanted this, but somehow she knew it was coming. It had been too long since their last confrontation, and there was no way her father could just let her go without a final attempt at pulling her back into the fold. I'm not interested in Mason Industries, Dad, Max replied, her tone firmer than she felt. I've told you that. I know, he said, his voice softening slightly, but still carrying the weight of authority. But you don't understand. The company is struggling. We've been losing ground in the industry for years. We need a fresh direction, something new. Max's pulse quickened. She could hear the desperation in his voice. He was asking for her help. The same man who had dismissed her, who had never believed in her, was now calling for her to save the very legacy he had built. The irony of it stung. I'm not the one to help you with that, Dad, she said, her voice tight. You didn't want me in your world before, and I'm not going to jump back in just because you've hit a rough patch. I built my career on my own. I'm not a part of your legacy, and I never will be. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Max could almost hear him processing her words, trying to figure out his next move. Finally, he spoke again, his voice more measured now. I made a mistake, Max. I should have believed in you. I've been wrong all these years. You've made something of yourself, and I see that now. But I need you. We need you. Max clenched her jaw, the anger bubbling up inside her. It's too late for that. You never saw me for who I really am. I'm not the little girl you wanted to groom for your business. I'm an actress, a creator. I don't need your approval anymore, and I'm not coming back to fix what you broke. She hung up the phone before he could say another word, feeling a rush of liberation, followed by a sharp pang of guilt. Her father had admitted his mistake, but that didn't change everything that had happened. She didn't need him to acknowledge her now. What she needed was for him to understand that he couldn't control her life anymore. Max stood still for a moment, letting the silence of her trailer settle around her. She wasn't going back. Not to him. Not to their world. She was free. Max's mind raced as she stepped out of her trailer onto the set, the words from her father's call still echoing in her ears. She felt a strange sense of calm, but also the weight of something she couldn't shake. That call, the admission of failure, the plea for help. Her father had finally acknowledged her existence as something more than a disappointment. But was it too little? Too late? As she walked through the bustling set, she tried to shake off the heavy thoughts. She had learned not to let her personal life interfere with her work, but today was different. Everything felt charged, as if the air around her crackled with possibility. This wasn't just another day on set. This was the day she truly stepped into the life she had fought so hard to build. This was her moment of freedom. Chris Blake, the director who had believed in her when no one else did, approached her with a smile. He could tell something was off. He'd been around long enough to know when something wasn't right. "Max," he called, stepping up beside her. "Everything okay? You seem a little distracted." Max looked at him, her eyes soft but full of determination. She had always been guarded, always kept her walls high, but now, standing in front of Chris, someone who had helped her rise from the ashes, she felt the pull of something she had kept buried for so long. The truth. She had to say it. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. "I just spoke to my dad," she said, her voice tight. "I'm done trying to please him. Done trying to fit into a mold that wasn't meant for me. I've spent my whole life trying to prove myself, and I'm tired. I'm not going back to that world." Chris nodded, not needing to say much. He had always known how much she had sacrificed to get here, how much her family's expectations weighed on her. He knew how deep the wounds ran, how difficult it was to break free from a legacy that had been thrust upon her from the moment she was born. "You're doing it, Max," he said quietly. "You're here, and that's all that matters. No one can take that away from you." For the first time in years, Max felt a sense of peace. The weight on her shoulders, the expectations, the constant tug-of-war with her past, it all began to slip away. She was no longer just a reflection of what her family wanted her to be. She was her own person, with her own dreams, and she was finally free to chase them without looking over her shoulder. As the crew called her name to take her mark, she smiled for the first time that day. She stepped into the spotlight, not as Don Rivera's daughter, but as Maxine Rivera, the actress who had made her own way on her own terms. She was no longer trapped by her past. She was free. It was a quiet evening when Max received the email. She had just wrapped up another intense filming session, her body aching with exhaustion, but her heart alive with purpose. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen to see the name of her father's company, Mason Industries, staring back at her. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't heard from them in months, hadn't wanted to hear from them. But something about this email felt different. There was no angry demand this time, no accusatory tone. It was business, formal. Her father was offering her something, but the question was why. The email simply stated, "Maxine, we are in need of a consultant. Mason Industries is facing a critical transformation, and your expertise could help. Please contact us if you are interested in discussing this opportunity." Max stared at the screen for a long moment, the words sinking in. They were asking her to help. It was not a demand, not a command. This wasn't about her being a daughter who owed them. This was a genuine request for her skills, for the very thing they had once rejected, her creativity and vision. She sat back in her chair, staring out the window of her apartment, the city skyline a distant blur. Everything in her wanted to ignore the email, to keep walking away and never look back. They had dismissed her for so long. Why should she return now, after all the sacrifices she had made to carve her own path? But deep down, she knew this wasn't just about them. It was about closure. It was about proving to herself that she had the power to change not just her own future, but their future as well. Max pressed reply. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, unsure of the words to say. Finally, she typed, "I'm interested. Let's talk." The decision had been made. Max had never felt more out of place than she did when she stepped into the boardroom of Mason Industries. The sleek, polished wood, the high-backed chairs, the cold, formal atmosphere. It was all so familiar, yet alien to her now. The place that had once felt like home, a place where she had dreamed of belonging, now felt like a foreign land, filled with ghosts of expectations and regrets. She had dressed carefully, choosing a simple yet elegant outfit. No more hiding in the shadows. Today she was here as a professional, a force to be reckoned with, not the rebellious daughter who had once left it all behind. Her father, Don Rivera, was already sitting at the head of the table, his usual air of authority present, but somehow less intimidating. His eyes flicked up as she entered, and for a moment Max saw something in his gaze, a mixture of surprise, respect, and maybe even a touch of guilt. It wasn't enough to erase the years of tension between them, but it was a start. "Maxine," he said, his voice warm but guarded. "I wasn't sure you would come." "I didn't know I had a choice," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. She wasn't here to be emotional. She was here to fix what they had broken. Across the table, her brother James sat, his posture stiff, his arms crossed in a way that spoke volumes. He had always been the one to take their father's side, the golden child who had never strayed from the path. His eyes met hers briefly, and for a split second, Max could see the familiar flicker of jealousy and competition in his gaze. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. Dawn motioned for her to sit, and she did, feeling the weight of their collective gazes on her. There was an unspoken tension in the room, a recognition that something had shifted. They were no longer dealing with the naive daughter who had walked out all those months ago. She had changed, and they had too, whether they wanted to admit it or not. "I know you've made a name for yourself in Hollywood," Don began, his voice steady. "But this company, Max, it's more than just business. It's a legacy. And we need someone with vision, someone who can bring us into the future." Max raised an eyebrow. She had heard those words before, but now they felt empty. The company her father had built was crumbling, and it wasn't just about vision. It was about change, about letting go of the past, about adapting to the new world that Max had embraced. "I don't know if I can fix your legacy," she said slowly, meeting her father's eyes. "But I can help you build something new, if you're ready for that." Her words hung in the air, a challenge, a promise. For the first time in her life, she wasn't asking for approval. She was offering a solution, one that would change the course of their future, and perhaps her own. Max had always known that change didn't come easy, but as she sat at the boardroom table in the weeks that followed, watching her father and brother reluctantly begin to adapt to her ideas, she realized just how hard it was for them. The corporate world they had built was stiff, filled with old-school methods that felt suffocating. She could see the resistance in their eyes, the subtle skepticism every time she spoke. They didn't believe in the vision she had for Mason Industries, not at first. It wasn't that they were unwilling to listen, but they had built their empire on tradition, on a model that had worked for decades. The idea of digital transformation, of taking the company in a completely new direction, was terrifying for them. The fear of losing control, of breaking down everything they knew, was palpable. But Max wasn't going to give up. She had spent years watching from the outside, learning from the best in Hollywood, absorbing everything she could about how industries changed, how they adapted, how they grew. She was no longer the girl who had left in anger and frustration. She was a leader now. She had the knowledge, the skills, and the passion to turn Mason Industries into something that would thrive in the future. The first step was small: revamping their technology infrastructure, streamlining operations with software that could predict market trends and improve efficiency. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Her father, initially resistant, had reluctantly agreed. James, on the other hand, was a harder sell. He clung to the old ways, seeing no need for change, especially when the company still made a profit, even if it was shrinking. But when the first quarter's numbers came back, showing a marked improvement in productivity and efficiency, Dawn's eyes had finally opened. The old guard was crumbling, but Max's vision was working. Slowly, the walls of resistance began to fall. James, too, had started to see the merit in her ideas, though he still maintained a certain level of pride and skepticism. The moment that truly signified the shift came one late afternoon, when Max sat down with her father. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the boardroom as he leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful. "You were right," he said, the words slow, deliberate, as though admitting it had cost him something. "I was wrong about you, about all of this. You've changed things for the better." Max's heart beat a little faster, but she didn't allow herself to react. She had been waiting for this moment, but it still felt surreal. "I didn't do this for you, Dad," she said, her voice steady. "I did it for the company." For the future, Don nodded, his gaze steady, but this time there was no judgment in it, no dismissal, just acknowledgement. It wasn't the approval she had wanted as a child, but it was something even more powerful: respect. The change wasn't just in Mason Industries. It was in her father, in James, in the way they saw her, and in the way they began to trust her vision. Max had proven that she didn't need to sacrifice her dreams to be a part of their world. She had transformed the company, but more importantly, she had transformed herself. And for the first time, Max knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not in her father's shadow, but standing in the light of her own making. It was the morning after the big announcement, and Max sat in her small office, looking out over the city. The sunlight filtered through the glass windows, casting a soft glow across the room. The air felt different today, as if the world had shifted just slightly on its axis. The day before, she had formally taken her place as a key member of Mason Industries, not as a rebellious daughter trying to prove something, but as the leader they had finally acknowledged. Max felt an odd mixture of pride and exhaustion. She had spent the last few months fighting not just for the company's future, but for her own place within it. Now, she was being entrusted with the future of something far greater than herself, something she had once been expected to destroy by leaving it all behind. Her father had signed off on the new strategic direction she'd proposed: digital transformation, a shift towards innovation, integrating cutting-edge tech with their decades-old manufacturing base. They were no longer clinging to the past. Mason Industries was going to evolve, and it would do so with her at the helm of change. Yet even as Max took a seat at the conference table later that morning, the weight of her success didn't feel like the victory she had imagined. The people around her, her father, James, the senior executives, all looked to her with a new respect, but there was still a quiet wariness in their eyes. They had accepted her ideas, but not entirely. Trust wasn't something that could be given overnight, not after years of her being absent from their world. But today, it wasn't about them. Today, it was about Max. It was about reclaiming her rightful place in a world that had once rejected her and forging ahead on her own terms. The first few minutes of the meeting were filled with the usual pleasantries and strategic planning. But as the room settled into discussion, Max could feel the shift. The change she had fought for was beginning to take root. Her ideas were no longer questioned, but accepted. She was leading them, not just as their daughter, but as a visionary in her own right. When the meeting ended and everyone began filing out, James lingered at the door. For a moment, he stood there, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Finally, he spoke. "You know, I didn't think you'd make it. But now I get it." Max's heart beat a little faster. "What do you mean?" James smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "You were right all along. The future isn't in what we've been doing. It's in what you're doing. Just don't forget where you came from." Max nodded, a feeling of understanding passing between them. For the first time, she felt like they were on the same side. The company wasn't just hers to lead. It was theirs to build together. She didn't have to destroy her past to embrace her future. She could have both. As she watched James leave the room, Max allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. This was the new beginning she had dreamed of. Not just for Mason Industries, but for herself. She wasn't just the daughter of Don Rivera anymore. She was Maxine Rivera, an innovator, a leader, and a force to be reckoned with. And this was only the beginning. Max stood in the boardroom, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips as she gazed around the room. The glass walls reflected the sunlight pouring through the windows, casting a warm, golden glow across the sleek, polished table. The room was no longer just a place of business for her. It had become a symbol of the transformation she had fought for, both in the company and in herself. In the months since she had taken the reins of Mason Industries, everything had changed. The digital platforms had been integrated, and with it, the company had found a new rhythm, one that was in tune with the future, not bound by the weight of tradition. The board meetings were different now. They were collaborative, with ideas flowing freely, challenges being met with solutions rather than resistance. Max had proved herself, not just to the executives around her, but to the industry. She had found her place. Her father, Don, had stepped back from his role as CEO and had taken on a position as an advisor. It wasn't the role he had imagined for himself, but it was one he had come to accept. Slowly, over time, he had begun to realize that Max's way was the way forward. The company had adapted to the new digital age, and Mason Industries was flourishing in ways that they had never anticipated. Max had done it. She had turned the family legacy into something new, something sustainable. But more than that, she had created a future that no longer depended on her father's vision alone. She had created her own vision, one that embraced innovation, creativity, and a willingness to take risks. Standing before the board now, she was no longer the young woman trying to prove herself. She was a leader in her own right, and her presence in the room demanded the respect she had long been denied. The quiet hum of accomplishment buzzed in her ears as she addressed the group, outlining the next phase of their expansion, the growth she had always dreamed of, one where the company would continue to thrive in the tech-driven future. Her brother James now sat beside her at the table. He had found his place, too, as the head of the manufacturing division, overseeing the integration of new tech into the company's production lines. It wasn't glamorous, but it was critical. They had learned, slowly but surely, to work together. He no longer viewed her as a rival, but as a partner. That shift alone had been one of the hardest things to navigate, but it had been worth it. For the first time, Max saw the potential for a true partnership, one that would propel them forward, not as a family caught in a tug of war, but as a cohesive unit. "Great work, Max," James said quietly after the meeting wrapped up, giving her a nod of approval. "You really turned this place around." Max felt the weight of his words, and for the first time, she could see the respect in his eyes, the acknowledgement of what she had achieved. "We did it together," she replied with a smile, her heart light. The old legacy wasn't gone, it had been rebuilt. This wasn't about her father's empire anymore. It was theirs now, shared equally between them, not shaped by the past, but guided by a vision for the future. A future that was just beginning, and it was one that Max would lead, with confidence and strength, knowing that this time she had built it on her terms.